Tonight we are brewing something special. Not soup, not tea, but something that once thought. A broth of memory, a simmer of silence. We're making skull stew. Yes, an actual human skull, boiled gently in water, sometimes with herbs, sometimes with wine, sometimes with whatever the 14th century considered spiritual seasoning. This wasn't just dinner, it was medicine. They believed that the skull, the very bowl of thought, could retain echoes of its former wisdom, power, and soul. Grind it, steep it, drink it, and you might absorb its strength. A migraine? A seizure? The hiccups? There's nothing a ladle of hot cranial stock couldn't fix. So, fluff your pillow, loosen your neck, and let us carry you into a world where skulls were sacred, boiling was healing, and death was just the start of a good recipe. Welcome to the Boiled Skull Cure. The first thing you must understand is that a skull does not boil quickly. It takes time, patience, and preferably a very large pot. In a quiet village nestled in the rolling fog of 16th century Germany, there was once a man known only as Apothecary Klaus. He did not sell herbs. He did not sell bandages. He sold heads. Not fresh ones, of course. That would be vulgar. No, Klaus specialized in what he called the bones of knowing. Skulls carefully selected from the recently deceased, ideally those who had died heroically or with at least one good Latin quote on their deathbed. Because, as everyone knew, wisdom seeped into the bone, especially in the final breath. If the dying man had said something profound, even better. If he had been a scholar, a monk, a poet, wunderbar. And if he had been decapitated mid-sermon, jackpot. These skulls, Klaus insisted, could be transformed into medicine, but only with proper cooking. He would begin by inspecting the cranium for cracks. Fractures were fine, they let the broth breathe. But mold? That was a no-no. Even in 1572, nobody wanted spoiled philosopher soup. Once selected, the skull was soaked in a bath of vinegar and rose water. This was not for hygiene. This was for spiritual softness. The acidic blend, he claimed, loosened the stubborn memories lodged in the bone. The rose water? That was for aromatics. Then came the boiling. A large iron pot sat in the center of Klaus's shop, bubbling gently, always warm, always waiting. Into it went wine, red for rage, white for purity, and occasionally beer for the common cold. The skull was lowered slowly, as if baptizing it in the afterlife. Customers would sit around, sipping their own drinks, watching the skull spin lazily in the pot like a grotesque dumpling. No one spoke. It was a reverent silence. Sometimes you could hear a crack, sometimes a whistle from the steam, and sometimes, if you were lucky, a gentle plop as the final piece of resistance gave way. This was considered a sign. The skull had opened, and with it the healing could begin. There is a strange comfort in rituals, even ones involving boiling heads. The act of preparing the medicine was often more therapeutic than the medicine itself. Patients came not only for the cure, but for the theater. It was a performance, a sacred brew born from death, promising life. Some even brought their own family skulls. My uncle had visions, one might say. He spoke to angels or possibly pigeons. Either way, boil him, please. Others came with more sinister intent. My neighbor was terribly clever. Awful man, but clever. I'll pay extra. Klaus did not judge. His wall was lined with shelves labeled by occupation: saints and scribes, madmen and mathematicians, barbers and butchers. It was said that each skull produced a different flavor of cure. A bishop's skull made a broth that soothed fevers. A poet's skull helped with melancholy. A jester's skull was rumored to cure constipation, though Klaus warned this might be more of a placebo effect. And then there was the king's head, locked in a wooden box behind the shop, sealed with 3 iron latches and guarded by a stuffed raven named Heinrich. It was said to contain the cranium of a deposed monarch. No one knew which king. No one dared ask. Klaus claimed that a single drop of this brew could stop a seizure mid-shake, soothe a scream, or even restore the memory of a forgotten name. Was it true? No one knew, but the box remained, and Heinrich stared at all who entered, glass-eyed and judgmental. Let us take a moment now to consider the science. There was none. No one had measured the medicinal value of a skull stew. No university published a paper. No scholar ran a double-blind test with one group drinking boiled femur and another sipping skull soup. But did that matter? To the people who believed it worked. And belief is a powerful drug, especially when stirred clockwise with bay leaves and hope. The patients came. The pot boiled, and Apothecary Klaus continued his work, ladling out cups of wisdom broth to the limping, the shaking, the whispering. Each sip was taken slowly. Each cup was emptied with reverence. They said it tasted like metal, like pennies or old rain, but also like closure. Tonight, as you lie in your bed, imagine the gentle steam rising from a cauldron of history, a quiet room, flickering candlelight, and a man in a leather apron carefully ladling thoughts into mugs. There is peace in the absurd. There is comfort in the idea that bones remember. So rest now. Your skull is safe for now. But should it ever be boiled, may it bring someone peace. Before we delve any deeper into the steaming pot of bony remedies, we must ask the most important question. What exactly do you add to a skull stew? For while the skull may be the main ingredient, the star of the dish, even the boldest cooks of history knew that flavor requires finesse. And by flavor, we of course mean spiritual alignment. Let's begin with the base. A true medicinal skull broth, according to apothecaries like Klaus, required at least one liquid of noble origin. Not water from a stream, never that. Too natural, too wild. Water is for the living. Skull stews demanded something holier. Holy water? Sometimes. But that was reserved for exorcisms or particularly stubborn migraines. Wine? Often, preferably a vintage that had aged alongside the deceased. Poetic pairing. Goat's milk? Only if the goat had shared a dream with you. Rainwater caught during a full moon? Now you're talking. To this base, one would add herbs. Not chosen for their medicinal properties, of course, that would be too obvious, but for their symbolism. Sage for memory. Rosemary for ghosts, thyme for forgiveness, lavender to keep the stew from smelling like a butcher's sink. And if one were feeling especially daring, a few drops of tincture of nightshade, not for healing but for drama. After all, if you're sipping the essence of a poet's skull, why not add a little edge? But the most prized additive of all was bone ash. Yes, ash. From a cremated body, preferably someone wise, possibly someone who had once written a very long letter to the Pope. This ash, carefully collected and sifted through a silk cloth, would be pinched and sprinkled like finishing salt. Not stirred, never stirred. Stirring would wake the bone spirits, and nobody wanted that during digestion. Some healers believed the ash should be inhaled, not consumed. Others recommended smearing it on one's forehead in the shape of a question mark. But Klaus, he preferred the traditional method. Into the pot it went, sizzling on contact, as if the skull was reacting to the arrival of an old friend. And so the recipe would simmer, hours, sometimes days. The apothecary would occasionally lift the lid and whisper to the broth, asking it for signs. Do you bubble in peace? Do you carry the cure? Have you remembered the last thoughts of the dead? If the bubbles aligned in a perfect circle, it was considered a blessing. If they spelled something vaguely alphabetical, it was a miracle. And if the stew hissed or spit, that was Tuesday. Now let us turn to those who drank it. It is one thing to prepare a potion of powdered braincase. It is quite another to willingly sip it. And yet they came, sick children, frail elders, sweating merchants with a shaking hand and too many secrets, women who believed their husbands were cursed, men who believed their dreams were haunted by unfinished poetry. One woman, known only as Brunhild the Widow, came weekly to Klaus's shop with a tin cup and a nervous smile. She believed her late husband, Gunther, had died with unresolved thoughts about turnips. She drank skull tea in hopes of understanding his agricultural secrets. She never did, but her garden was fantastic. There were, of course, skeptics, men in wigs, scholars from the cities, doctors with thermometers and disapproving eyebrows. They would enter the shop, pinch their noses, and declare the practice barbaric, to which Klaus would respond, "And yet your leeches scream at night." Touché. Not all skulls were created equal. Some refused to boil. There are documented cases, scribbled in the margins of forgotten German manuscripts, of skulls that resisted the stew. They cracked too soon. They released strange oils. One allegedly hummed during boiling, emitting a tune only the apothecary's cat could hear. These skulls were deemed emotionally unstable and stored in padded drawers, beside jars labeled melancholia, condensed, and regret, powdered. But the most troublesome skull of all belonged to a philosopher who had died mid-argument. Klaus called him Herrhm. Every time Herrhm's skull was boiled, the stew would separate, thoughts and feelings refusing to blend. Customers who drank it became argumentative, doubting their own dreams, questioning shadows, debating chairs. The skull was eventually buried in a field with no concept of dualism, just in case. As the practice spread beyond Klaus's foggy village, new interpretations emerged. In France, monks boiled skulls with honey and cinnamon, believing sweet thoughts made for sweeter cures. In Italy, they added garlic for protection naturally. In England, someone tried it with tea. It was awful, but polite. Some experimented with multi-skull brews. A philosopher, a warrior, and a virgin, all steeped together. The results were confusing. One patient grew a beard, wept uncontrollably, and wrote 4 sonnets about swords before passing out. So why did they do it? Was it belief, desperation, a fascination with the echo chamber of the cranium? Perhaps all 3, or perhaps, and this is the thought we leave you with tonight, perhaps they knew something we have forgotten. that the body remembers, that the skull, once a vessel for thought, can still whisper, that in the right hands even a bone can comfort. So sleep now. Let your own skull settle softly into your pillow. Feel its curves, its hollows, its quiet strength. You are a vessel of memories. You are the future's recipe. And if one day someone boils your head, may they season it well. Where you might ask, does one get a skull? It's not as if the local market had a bone aisle between the cheese and the leeches. No, dear listener, procuring a skull was an art, a profession, and, for a lucky few, a calling. They were known as the bone men, travelers of graveyards, whisperers to dirt. Half undertaker, half librarian, they knew not only where people were buried, but why and how long they'd been thinking underground. You couldn't just dig up any skull. Oh no, that was amateur work. You needed a skull with purpose, a head that had seen things, died dramatically, thought deeply, maybe even shouted "new" before collapsing. That kind of head had flavor. The bone men carried special tools: a silver trowel for quiet earth, a lantern with blue glass to see regret, whatever that means, and a sack made from goat hide, stitched with hair from a horse that had survived war. Yes, it was all very theatrical, but skulls are picky passengers, and they preferred drama. Some bone men claimed they could hear which graves whispered, "Not yet." Others said they tasted the soil. If it was bitter, the skull still held grudges. If it was sweet, ready to serve. Apothecary Klaus did not dig himself. No, he was a man of the shop, a curator of heads, not a collector. Instead, he had an arrangement with Jorg, a professional bone man with only 3 fingers and a limp that screamed backstory. Jorg would arrive once a month with a cart that smelled of spice, mildew, and ambition. Each skull was presented like a wine tasting. This one peasant possibly trampled. Lots of trauma, earthy notes. This one nun died during prayer. Very clean. No biting. This one tax collector, still scowling, excellent for ulcers. Klaus would examine them, knock gently on the temples, listening for hollow truths, and assign them to shelves like fine porcelain. Sometimes the skulls came with stories, like the twin brothers who had died dueling over a recipe. Their skulls couldn't be stored together. They'd roll off the shelves in the night, or the skull of Margarita the Loud, who, even in death, made the broth boil faster, as if trying to finish her final sentence. Or Bishop Ulrich, whose stew glowed faintly. Klaus insisted it was the reflection of candlelight. Jorg said it hummed hymns. A mouse nearby learned Latin. Coincidence? We'll never know. As the popularity of skull cures spread, demand outpaced supply. This led naturally to creative sourcing. Churchyards began to thin mysteriously. Crypt doors were found ajar. Tombs were suddenly less full than they used to be. This did not go unnoticed. So, in 1583, the Holy Order of Ossuary-Pharmacists issued an official decree. All skulls used in medical preparation must be lawfully deceased, respectfully acquired, and spiritually rinsed. This was widely ignored. Instead, a black market formed. Secret auctions, coded messages, people whispering, "I've got a priest with perfect symmetry, mint condition." One infamous apothecary, known only as Mad Agnes, claimed to sell celebrity skulls. Kings, heretics, one horse. She was shut down after a batch of skull soup caused 40 patients to believe they were cats. Of course, some skulls came willingly. Donors. Yes, you heard that right. Certain intellectuals, often philosophers, poets, and men who had far too much time alone, declared in their wills that their skulls should be boiled for the benefit of humanity. I give my thoughts, my dreams, and my frontal bone to the future, wrote Erasmus von Tibbensnort in 1591. His skull was used to treat melancholy for over 40 years. Side effects included excessive sighing and a love of candlelight. There were even fashion trends in skull collecting. At one point, skulls with mustache residue were all the rage. Later, left-handed thinkers became prized. Their skulls allegedly swirled the stew in the opposite direction. Then came the era of painted skulls, those decorated after death, often with gold leaf or tiny poems. These were rarely boiled. They were displayed like celebrity perfumes. Klaus detested these. Decoration dilutes intention, he'd mutter. Also, gold tastes terrible. Let us now consider the ethics. Is it wrong to boil a skull? Is it desecration or devotion? To those like Klaus, it was neither. It was gratitude. Each ladle poured was a thank you. Each sip, a eulogy. He believed that to use the skull was to honor its memories, to allow the dead to continue thinking through the lives of others. He once said, "Better to bubble in a pot than rot in silence." That line was later carved above his door, in bone. So tonight, as your breath slows and the weight of sleep pulls you downward, imagine a quiet room filled with labeled skulls. Each one once laughed. Each one once cried. Each one now waits, not in fear but in purpose. You are not alone. You carry your thoughts in a vault of bone. And perhaps one day, someone will find comfort in your silence, too. But for now, let the earth rest. Let the bone men sleep. And may your dreams be free of trowels. If you thought boiling a skull was a crude, bubbling affair, the kind of thing done by candlelight with a wild grin and a wooden spoon, well, you'd only be partly right. Because despite the disturbing nature of the process, there was a method, a ceremony, and even, dare we say, a certain etiquette. Yes, dear sleeper, welcome to the official instructional guide. How to boil a skull. The gentle way. Step 1. Select the skull. As we've established, not just any bone dome will do. The ideal skull must be free from mortal sin, or at least rinsed with salt water and apology. Intact unless you're making cracked wisdom tea. From a person who died with intention. Accidental deaths were considered emotionally scrambled. And most importantly, the skull must be willing. Yes, even if the donor is dead, he must have been willing in principle. A reluctant cranium will make the pot froth aggressively and can cause philosophical gas. Step 2. Cleanse the vessel. The skull should be soaked overnight in a bath of rainwater from the east side of town. A splash of lemon for brightness. 2 prayers whispered by someone who once had a nosebleed. Then brushed gently with a goose feather brush, unless the skull belonged to a knight. In which case, use a badger. This step is crucial. As Klaus used to say, clean bone, clean thoughts. Step 3. Prepare the broth. The liquid must match the personality of the skull. For scholars, aged wine and ink water. For soldiers, beef stock and a musket ball. For artists, pear juice and regret. For accountants, tepid water and a single coin. Avoid citrus with dramatic people. Causes emotional cloudiness. Heat the broth until it shivers, not boils. If it boils too quickly, the memories flee. You want a gentle simmer, as if the liquid is listening to your heartbeat. Step 4. The lowering. Never drop the skull into the pot. Lower it slowly. Speak to it. Assure it that the boiling is not punishment, but transformation. Many preferred to recite poetry at this stage. Haikus were particularly effective. One popular example, thought once thundered here, now it steeps bone deep in steam, healing from silence. If you hear a hiss, it's not the skull. It's the past being released. Or steam, or the kettle. Hard to say. Step 5. Watch for signs. This is not a passive stew. The skull communicates. A swirl in the shape of a spiral. Clarity is near. 3 bubbles in a triangle. Divine approval. A sudden crack. The skull has told you its final secret. A tiny voice that says, "I'm not soup." Ignore that. It's probably gas. If the skull begins to rattle, do not panic. Simply reduce the heat and complement its cheekbones. Step 6. The skimming. During boiling, surface froth may appear. This is called brain fog. Skim gently with a silver spoon. Dispose of the froth respectfully. Either bury it, bless it, or feed it to a very serious goat. Never reuse it. It's emotionally spent. Step 7. Serving the brew. Once the skull has fully infused the broth, usually after 1 hour per year the person was alive, ladle the liquid into dark ceramic cups. Never glass. It shows the color. That's a mistake. Additions are optional. A pinch of salt if the patient is bitter. A dash of nutmeg if they miss someone. A honey date if they can't let go. Inhale the steam. Do not sip too quickly. Skull broth should be listened to, not consumed. Klaus often said, "Drink too fast, and you'll inherit their regrets." Common side effects: vivid dreams, temporary understanding of ancient dialects, crying at sunrises, a compulsion to write letters to people you've never met. Now let us visit a real example, the case of little Otto. Little Otto was 7, prone to fits, night terrors, and the belief that his furniture resented him. His mother, desperate for answers, brought him to Klaus. After careful evaluation, Klaus selected the skull of a retired juggler who had once survived being struck by lightning and who had written poetry about spoons. It was boiled in pear juice and milk. Yes, milk. The resulting brew smelled of rain, apples, and disappointment. Little Otto drank it slowly. That night he slept soundly. In the morning he whispered, "The chair forgives me," and never screamed again. But not all brews were smooth. There was the time Klaus accidentally mixed 2 skulls, a philosopher and a horse trainer. The resulting concoction gave a man the ability to quote Aristotle and neigh on command. Or the tragic case of Helga the Unshakable, who demanded, "The strongest skull you've got." Klaus gave her the head of a doomsday prophet. She spent the next week convinced the moon was watching her bathe. Still, the process endured. Why? Because it gave people something modern medicine never could: narrative. When you drink from a skull, you become part of a story. You're not just swallowing a remedy. You're sipping a life, a legacy, a very warm autobiography. It's ridiculous. It's grotesque. It's oddly comforting. So tonight, as your own thoughts begin to settle, imagine a bubbling pot on a wooden stove. A skull, eyes long gone, gently swirling in warm wine and thyme. A man in an apron whispering thanks to the steam. You are safe. Your bones are yours, and your memories, for now, remain unboiled. Sleep softly and stir slowly, somewhere in the back room of Apothecary Klaus's shop. Past the shelves of powdered remorse, tinctured regrets, and emotionally unstable leeches, hung a chalkboard. Not for reminders, not for prices, but for the daily special. Yes, the skull stew had evolved. What had once been a desperate folk cure had become a culinary art. And with it came menus, pairings, courses, and yes, even complaints from picky customers. The chalkboard read, today's skull broths, the lover, passion fatigue, voice tremors. The strategist, memory gaps, weak chess skills. The drunkard, excellent for hiccups and shame. The nun who swore once, spiritual turbulence. Each title told a story. Each stew, a personality. Each cup, a chance to borrow someone else's mental seasoning. And people came in droves. Because as absurd as it sounds, nothing quite calms the nerves like sipping hot logic from a tactician's cranium or soothing heartbreak with a dash of dead romance. Let us explore a few of these recipes. 1. The Lover's Reduction. Base: rose petal tea and cheap wine. Additives: clove, whispers, and the ashes of a love letter. Made from the skull of a woman who once eloped with a goat herder, returned, and eloped again. This broth was said to reset the heart. Side effects included spontaneous weeping, nostalgia for smells, and the urge to write poetry about hands. One patient claimed she could smell her ex's laugh after drinking it. She did not enjoy this. 2. The Strategist's Bouillon. Base: beef stock, ink, and a single black feather. Additives: ground walnut, charred parchment. Boiled from the skull of a retired military advisor who only spoke in riddles, this clear broth promised sharper thinking and better bedtime arguments. Best consumed in silence, with gloves. Reported benefits: remembering where you left your keys, winning imaginary debates, becoming suspicious of staircases. One elderly man drank 2 cups and spent the night reorganizing his entire family tree. 3. The Nun's Whisper. Base: chamomile, rainwater, a single forgiven secret. Additives: powdered pearl, thyme, a hair from a pure-hearted stranger, distilled from the skull of Sister Margarita, who, despite a spotless record, once stubbed her toe and said something very bold. This brew was for those seeking internal quiet. Mildly glowing, this tea was sipped during confession or before unpleasant dinners with relatives. Side effects included temporary angelic humming and feeling as though one were being gently watched by approval. Now, you might ask, how did Klaus know which skull produced which effect? An excellent question. He didn't. Not at first. Much like early vintners, he relied on tasting notes. Each new skull was tested by a small group of volunteers, affectionately called the Sip Society. Members included a baker with an overactive sense of smell, a woman who could faint on command, 2 twins who only answered in unison, and a goat named Dr. Mintz. They would sip, they would sit, and they would report. I feel melancholic but refreshed. My ears are warm and I suddenly understand my mother. Dr. Mintz has eaten a spoon. Based on this feedback, Klaus would assign the skull a name, a pairing, and a shelf. Tasting events became quite the fashion. Invitations were handwritten on parchment soaked in broth vapor. Candlelit rooms were prepared. Soft harpsichord music played. Guests were blindfolded, served mystery skull tea, and asked to describe their visions. One popular brew, served under the code name The Crooked Lawyer, made several guests confess to crimes they'd never committed, including stealing thunder, cheating at chess, and once dreaming impolitely. It was deemed too effective and removed from the rotation. Let's pause for a moment. Close your eyes, unless you're chopping onions. Imagine sipping someone else's mind. Not just their thoughts, but their instincts, their fears, their dreams. Now imagine doing so with a hint of rosemary and a side of dark bread. It's ridiculous. It's beautiful. The soup. The stews even had seasons. Autumn featured thinkers in decline. Mellow, smoky, full of contemplative doubt. Winter offered saints and snowmen. Broths that made you feel hugged by a hymn. Spring rolled out newly dead specials. Slightly effervescent, sometimes bubbly. Summer was best avoided. Bone sweat after all. But not every recipe was a success. There was the ill-fated Three Accountants blend. Too bland. Caused users to lose their sense of time. One man stared at a clock for 7 hours and then asked if it had started yet. Or the child poet. Too abstract. Induced rhyming hiccups. And the silent philosopher. No flavor. No steam. Just quiet. So quiet it made people forget what questions were. Over time, Klaus began to write a book. A sommelier's guide to skull stews. Chapters included pairing spoons with personalities, emotional aftertastes, what your tears mean, when to serve a jester, the trouble with twins. It was never published. The manuscript was allegedly too powerful. Rumor says one reader forgot her own birthday and remembered everyone else's. So tonight, as the menu of your thoughts begins to wind down, remember this. Your mind too has flavor. Your memories steep daily. Your regrets are just spices waiting to be measured. You are a walking recipe. And one day, perhaps far in the future, someone may sip the steam of your dreams and say, "Ah yes, hints of laughter, notes of wonder, a strong finish of peace. Sleep now, the kitchen is closed, the broth is cooling. Tomorrow, another brew." When a practice becomes popular, even one as unorthodox as boiling the heads of the formerly opinionated, it eventually attracts the most dangerous of ingredients, scandal. Yes, dear dreamer, not all skulls were acquired with consent. Not every pot bubbled with ethical broth. And where there are bones, there are boundaries, waiting to be crossed by someone in a hat that's just a little too jaunty. Let us now enter the shadowy chapter of skull crime. It began, as most terrible things do, with a man named Bartholomew with intent. That was not his real name. He gave it to himself. Bartholomew, or Barty, was not a healer. He was a businessman, a man who saw potential in the dead not for comfort but for profit. While Klaus was carefully boiling philosopher heads and listening to the stew whisper metaphors, Barty was mass-producing skull soup by the barrel and selling it as a cure for absolutely everything. He called it headstrong. The only soup that thinks for you. It came in unlabeled jars, sealed with wax and promises. Claims included: erases trauma, heals heartbreak, tastes like justice, also good for plants. No one knew what was actually in it. It was grayish, fizzed slightly, and one customer swore it whispered, "Pay your taxes," when warmed. But Barty didn't stop at shady marketing. He began stealing skulls. From crypts, from fresh graves, from his neighbors. He even raided the cathedral ossuary, replacing priceless relics with turnips painted to resemble crania. No one noticed until one of the turnips sprouted during Easter. When accused, Barty claimed, "They asked to be helpful," posthumously, which was not technically illegal yet. The town erupted in panic. People locked up family plots, slept with their ancestors' skulls under their pillows. One man began wearing his grandfather's skull as a hat, just to be safe. A new profession emerged overnight: skull sitters, paid individuals who would sit atop graves, cross-legged, to deter thieves. They were paid in soup and suspicion. Klaus, of course, was horrified. He wrote stern letters. He published pamphlets. He even held a public demonstration titled, "How Not to Ruin a Dead Person." But it was too late. Barty had created an entire industry. Soon, knockoff broths flooded the market. Soul sippers, claimed to contain the essence of poets. Nog-nog, a festive seasonal stew of uncertain origin. Brucephalus, shaped like a horse head, aggressively spicy, each worse than the last. Eventually, a trial of bone was held. A real court, with judges, and a jury entirely made of monks who hadn't blinked in 40 years. The courtroom was cold. The air smelled like cloves and pre-regret. Barty was charged with bone forgery, unlicensed boiling, fraudulent wisdom, emotional soup crimes. He defended himself by boiling his own defense attorney and offering the jury a sip. It was not well received. Witnesses were called. Klaus testified while holding the skull of a former public speaker as a character reference. One widow wept as she described finding her husband's skull filled with gravy. A chicken appeared in court and laid an egg. Its relevance was unclear, but it softened the mood. In the end, Barty was found guilty of all charges, including suspicious enthusiasm. His sentence: to spend the rest of his life eating only his own broth. He wept, then added the tears to the pot, and said, "Needs salt." After the trial, new laws of skull handling were passed. No skull may be boiled without prior permission from the deceased or a morally clean next of kin. All skull broths must list origin, mood, and spice level. Skulls must be stored with dignity, preferably on shelves with tiny pillows. All labels must clearly state, "May cause metaphysical dizziness." A special seal was introduced, certified bone-worthy, a small stamp of approval showing a smiling skull holding a ladle. Klaus was asked to oversee the registry. He accepted reluctantly, and only after insisting on very tiny paperwork. Even still, the scars remained. Some refused to drink skull broth ever again. Others demanded ethical skull options, only from monks, poets, or people who had died listening to lullabies. One trend emerged: self-stew wills, legal documents in which individuals could specify their post-mortem boiling instructions. Common entries included: boil me with bay leaf and sarcasm. Use only if someone really needs to remember my birthday. Add me to soup when Mercury is in retrograde. Don't boil me. I was mostly boring. But perhaps the strangest reaction came from the skulls themselves. Some began to go quiet. No whispers, no bubbles, no essence. It was as if, in protest of their commercial exploitation, they'd gone on strike. Klaus described it as emotional evaporation. Others called it soul burnout. One batch of stew simply floated into the air as mist, spelling the word "no" before vanishing. It was the only known case of soup refusing to be sipped. And so the boiling continued, but more gently, more respectfully, with reverence, with ladles carved by hand and mugs wrapped in silk. Because in the end, the skull is not just bone. It is the vault of a person, and like all vaults, it deserves to echo. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine a quiet courtroom where even the soup is judged. Let the murmurs fade. Let the gavel fall. Let the bones rest. You are innocent. You are whole. And your thoughts, for now, remain unbottled. Sleep well. Your skull is safe. Long after the scandal of Bartholomew with Intent had faded into cautionary bedtime tales and soup shop whispers, there emerged something entirely new. A museum, not of bones, not of medicine, but of thought, encased in skulls, steeped in memory, and displayed with velvet ropes. It was called the Museum of Thinking Heads. Founded by a retired nun, a one-eyed librarian, and a man who claimed to be the reincarnation of a kettle, the museum stood at the edge of a misty cliff, housed in an old lighthouse that had never seen the sea. Its motto was carved above the door. Before brains were scanned, they were steeped. Inside, the museum glowed with candlelight and very serious silence. Visitors were asked to whisper, walk slowly, and never wink at the exhibits. Some of the skulls found it provocative. Each room held a theme: Hall of Melancholy Thinkers, the Wing of Regrettable Geniuses, the Corridor of Almost Wise but Not Quite, the Vestibule of Culinary Philosophers. It smelled like time and apology. Each skull was suspended in a delicate glass orb, floating slightly above its pedestal. Thanks to a patented system involving magnets, rose water vapor and belief. Some orb labels included, Gregor the Unready said "wait" as his final word, suspected of leaving things emotionally unresolved. Lady von Lint remembered everyone's name but her own. Brew once cured amnesia and hiccups. The thinker who thought too loudly, known to crack windows when steeped too hot. Touching the glass was forbidden, but leaning close, that was encouraged. Some claimed they could hear whispers. Others swore the orbs shifted in their presence. One man fainted after a skull winked. It was later revealed to be a trick of the candlelight or guilt. Hard to say. The most popular exhibit? The boiling room, a perfectly preserved apothecary lab, reconstructed with artifacts from Klaus's original shop. There, each hour, a demonstration was performed by the museum's staff. Trained skull stewards in velvet gloves and embroidered aprons. They would lower a replica skull, ethically sourced, made of wood and stern looks, into a pot of symbolic broth. The audience would watch, The steward would whisper, "This is where the silence begins to speak." Steam would rise, a bell would chime, and visitors would be offered a cup of metaphorical tea, warm water with a hint of cinnamon and a suggestion of memory. They always said it tasted like déjà vu. But not all skulls remained passive. Some were interactive. In the room of echoes, guests could sit before a pedestal and ask a question. The orb above would glow or not, depending on the skull's mood. One guest asked, "Should I marry Bernard?" The orb flickered, then cracked slightly. She took it as a no. Another asked, "Why am I afraid of birds?" The orb remained dark. Pigeon outside exploded. Unrelated, unclear. Then there was the dream archive, a side chamber containing transcriptions of dreams said to be influenced by skull broths. These had been painstakingly recorded by volunteers, often written in candlelight while weeping softly into velvet journals. Examples included, "I was a chair, but felt appreciated. The moon said sorry and then bit me. I found a door in my grandmother's pocket. Smelled like soup. I went inside. I was the ladle. I was the ladle." Each entry was filed, categorized by emotion, and gently dusted weekly. No one knew what to do with them, but they felt important. Visitors left the museum changed, not necessarily wiser, not necessarily braver, but softened, as if their own skulls had been gently simmered in empathy and wrapped in sage leaves. Some said they dreamed of floating heads. Others developed a fondness for quiet stew. A few tried boiling books. It didn't work, but their homes smelled thoughtful for weeks. Of course, not everyone appreciated the museum. Critics called it macabre, unscientific, and a place that makes soup seem judgmental. One academic described it as theatrical bone washing, but others defended it. "It's not about skulls," wrote one supporter. "It's about memory, about listening, about finding a flavor in what's been forgotten." At the heart of the museum, in a private alcove behind a curtain stitched from philosopher robes, stood the founder's skull. Yes, Klaus, after his passing, his will had been precise. "Do not boil me, display me gently, and let no man sip my final thoughts without seasoning." His skull sat on a black velvet pillow, surrounded by dried herbs and tiny spoons, each one carved by patience he had once soothed. It did not glow, it did not hum, it simply sat, and somehow that was enough. As visitors exited, they were offered a small vial labeled, "Thought Tincture, contains no thoughts." It was warm. It smelled like cedar and quiet courage. Most kept it. Some drank it. A few swore they remembered something they hadn't learned yet. Tonight, as you lay your head upon your pillow, your own private pedestal, imagine that you too are a museum. Your memories suspended gently. Your worries dimly lit behind safety glass. Your best ideas steeping slowly. No one can boil your thoughts tonight, but you can simmer them. Softly, silently, with care. Sleep now. The museum is closed. The kettle is clean. Tomorrow we dream. By now you may be wondering, if drinking skull broth was once a sacred ritual, and later a fashionable remedy, did it ever become dinner? Oh yes. Welcome, sleepy traveler, to the final course of absurd medicine. Skull stew as social event. Because eventually the line between cure and cuisine blurred, and when it did, humanity did what it always does with blurred lines. We made a party out of it. It began innocently. A few aristocrats, emboldened by rumors of Klaus's success, began hosting healing suppers, candlelit gatherings where the main course was not just food, but experience. You didn't just eat. You imbibed personality. You slurped wisdom. You paired emotional soup with anxious bread. The invitations were extravagant. You are cordially invited to partake in a multi-course restoration of the soul, seasoned with memory, and gently strained through the sieve of mortality. Dress code: contemplative, appetizer, bone dust on toast. Dessert: unknown at the time of printing. Each guest was encouraged to bring a feeling as their offering. These were placed in jars at the door. Feelings included unfinished lullaby, accidental cruelty, and the moment before apology. The table was set with bone china, actual bone, yes, usually from cows, but sometimes not. Each bowl bore the etching of a famous last word. Some cheerful, "Tell my plants I love them." Some regretful, "Not the soup." Some ambiguous. Again, napkins were scented with bay leaf and faint remorse. Centerpieces were skulls, not for boiling, but for ambience. Some smiled, some grimaced. One had a monocle and a small top hat. His name was Sir Ruminator, and he was the topic of many dinner debates. The menu was structured like an opera. Overture sips of silence. Guests began with a shot of neutral skull broth. No known history, just a warm wash of clarity. Tasted like linen sheets, mild regret, and a breeze that forgot where it came from. 2. Act 1: Broth of Lover's Regret. Made from a skull discovered in a crypt clutching a locket and a torn poem. Served lukewarm, best consumed while staring wistfully into your spoon. 3. Interlude: Pickled Philosophy. Slices of parchment boiled in bone marrow broth, folded like dumplings. Each guest found a random idea written inside, such as, "Are we born or just steeped? Time is just tea we haven't tasted. Does bread mourn the grain?" 4. Act 2: The Mute Prophet. A thick stew made from a skull that never spoke in life. Believed to heal sore throats, encourage nodding, and cause brief moments of profound stillness. One guest wept into his bowl. The others applauded. Conversation at these events was structured. Guests were encouraged to speak in metaphor during the first course, in memory during the second, and in silence during dessert. Compliments to the chef were whispered or carved into radishes. No one ever shouted, except once, when someone spilled the philosopher's glaze on a velvet tablecloth. It caused a spontaneous ethical debate about materialism, sauce, and fate. Over time, social status became entangled with skull soup literacy. It was no longer enough to drink the stew. You had to analyze it. This tastes like betrayal, but aged beautifully. I detect notes of unfinished childhood. Ah, that's clearly an architect. Very structured, slightly cold. At one party, a guest declared, "This stew tastes like someone who meant well but overused semicolons." And the room went silent in reverent agreement. Naturally, snobbery followed. Some began collecting rare skulls, not for healing, but to serve exclusive tasting flights of mentalities. The Skull Broth Tasting Society was formed, complete with robes, secret handshakes, and spoons engraved with the Latin word for sip slowly. Klaus was invited to join. He declined. He said it was too chewy with ego. Then came the cutlery wars. Was it proper to sip with a ladle or slurp from a ceremonial cup? Could one dip bread into the broth of a bishop? Was it acceptable to garnish a general's skull stew with parsley? Opinions varied. Friendships ended. One couple divorced over whether a jester's broth should sparkle. To prevent further incidents, some hosts simply served the soup blindfolded. The skull dinners reached their peak with the infamous soup ball of 1603, hosted by Baroness Letitia von Dribble. The event featured an orchestra made entirely of people humming into spoons, a stew carousel, don't ask, a live reading of skull donation letters, and a finale in which all guests dipped a quill into communal broth and wrote anonymous compliments on rice paper, later folded into boats and set afloat in a vat of sage tea. The party lasted 14 hours. No one remembered the last 6, but everyone agreed it had depth. Eventually, the trend cooled, not because it was illegal, not because it was morally questionable, but because people began asking, are we still healing, or just flavor chasing? The answer was unclear, like broth left too long in thought. And so the dinners became quieter, simpler, more reflective, not gone, just simmered down. Now, as you lie in your bed, blanketed in softness, think of that long wooden table, a place where minds were sipped, memories seasoned, and every spoon held someone else's ending. Imagine raising a bowl to your lips, the steam rising, the flavor unfolding, not of garlic or thyme, but of story. Sleep now, little ladle. You are full enough, and the stew will still be warm in the morning. Once, in a village where fog arrived early and sleep came slowly, a girl named Lisbeth was born with a peculiar gift. She could hear skulls speak, not in words, not in voices, but in feelings, like distant thunder or the memory of music you never learned but always knew. Lisbeth grew up among bones. Her grandmother was the keeper of the village ossuary, a place filled with neat stacks of skulls, each one carefully labeled. Miller dreamed of the ocean. Midwife laughed at weddings. Thief regretted only once. These were not trophies. They were books of lives once lived, now bound in silence. But Lisbeth, when walking among them, felt pages turning. She described it like this: each skull has a weather. Some are cloudy with memory. Others are dry, brittle with secrets. Some thunder, some sigh, and some just wait. She never feared them. While other children played with dolls, Lisbeth arranged skulls in circles and gave them names. She served them tea, unboiled, told them stories, and occasionally apologized on behalf of the living. She once claimed a skull taught her how to tie her shoes. Another helped her find her way home during a snowstorm. And one, a baker's skull, gave her a recipe for apple tart that no one else remembered. It was very good. Word spread, as it always does when the absurd brushes up against the useful. Soon, villagers came not just to heal, but to listen. They would sit beside a chosen skull, hold it gently, and ask questions, not always expecting answers, but hoping for suggestions. Some heard dreams, some felt emotions, some claimed their arthritis improved slightly, others simply cried, then slept better. Lisbeth called this practice bone reading. She refused payment, but accepted thank you bread, knitted things, and handwritten regrets. As she grew older, Lisbeth began recording the weather of each skull. Warm drizzle of regret, sudden gust of laughter, dense fog of confusion with occasional clearing. She mapped the ossuary like a library of emotional climates, a place where one could walk not just through bones but through feelings preserved. It was not scientific, but it was deeply, deeply human. One day a visitor arrived, not local, not polite. He wore city boots and carried a small notebook. He said he was a rational archivist, come to assess the superstition quotient of local folk nonsense. He knocked on skulls like one tests fruit. He asked Lisbeth for metrics, citations, and peer-reviewed ghosts. She offered him tea. He declined. She offered him a skull. He rolled his eyes. She said, "Just hold it." Reluctantly, he did. Nothing happened. Then his hand trembled. His eyes blinked oddly. He whispered, "She forgave me." He left that night. Didn't even take notes. Not long after, Lisbeth became ill. Not with a sickness of the body, but of overhearing. She had listened too long, carried too many echoes, and the weight of other people's thoughts began to press on her ribs like unspoken songs. She retreated to the quietest part of the ossuary, the deep shelf where the oldest skulls rested, their memories faint as candle smoke. There she lay among them, wrapped in silence, and one by one the skulls whispered lullabies to her. When she passed, the villagers mourned quietly. They did not hold a grand funeral. They did not carve a statue. They placed her skull, gently, reverently, on a silk pillow beneath a window where the sun liked to pause, and they labeled it simply, "Lisbeth heard what others forgot." After that, the ossuary changed, not physically, but in tone. Visitors began to come from far away, not for healing, not for boiling, but to remember differently. A man sat for hours holding the skull of his brother, saying nothing. A woman brought her fears, whispered them to a jester's skull, and left smiling. A boy left a note for his future self, folded it into a paper bird, and placed it under the skull of a cartographer. The skulls, they said, were becoming more vivid, not louder, just clearer. Eventually, a new tradition formed. Each visitor who left feeling better, however they defined it, would add one small word to the wall, carved gently with a bone knife. The wall is still there. It is not famous. It is not studied, but it contains words like thanks, almost, peace, maybe, forgiven, begin, each one a kind of echo, each one a seasoning to someone else's silence. And so, tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine yourself walking slowly through that ossuary, not alone, each step gentle, each breath warm, skulls lining the shelves like books that once dreamed of being read. You don't need to ask anything. You don't need to understand. Just listen. Let the thoughts float by like dust in afternoon light. Let the silence say what it's been waiting to. You are heard. You are safe. And the skull you carry, your own, is full of stories yet to simmer. Sleep well. It began, as all great mysteries do, with something small. A single skull, one long considered reliable, steady, full of gentle hums and lukewarm epiphanies. simply stopped responding. It didn't crack. It didn't glow. It just went still. Apothecaries tapped it. Mediums hummed at it. One man tried to bribe it with chamomile. Nothing. It sat on its shelf like a teacup that had forgotten how to hold warmth. First, it was dismissed. Old skull, they said, needs a rest. Perhaps it's on holiday. But then another skull stilled. Then 3 more. Then 20. Whole shelves of once whispering, once simmering craniums now echoed nothing but dust and waiting. The community panicked. A hastily convened gathering of bone stewards was called in the town square. They arrived in cloaks, worried expressions, and travel mugs of emotional broth. They examined the skulls, sniffed them, tapped them. One even licked one. He was removed. Their conclusion? The skulls were done talking. Theories bloomed like overcooked cabbage. Some said the dead were tired of being boiled. Others believed modern minds had become too loud, drowning out the quiet thoughts of the departed. A child suggested the skulls had all joined a book club and didn't want to be disturbed. This was dismissed, but not entirely. One elderly man swore he'd heard a final whisper from his wife's skull. "That's enough, love. Let me nap." For the first time in centuries, people had to sit with their own thoughts. It was unpleasant. Accustomed to sipping clarity, to ladling certainty, to seasoning their sorrow with the spice of someone else's wisdom, many found themselves lost. One man stared into his empty cup for 6 hours, then declared, "I have no idea how I feel." Another attempted to boil his own skull. He survived. His hair did not. The apothecaries tried everything. They played music to the skulls, offered poetry, reboiled them in rosewater, regret, and reduced mystery. They even organized a skull appreciation parade, complete with bone marionettes and a choir of confused baritones. Still, the skulls remained silent. Not angry, not sullen, just absent, as if they had gently slipped their thoughts into the folds of the world and left. This period came to be known as the bone stillness. It lasted 33 days, and in that time the world changed. Not catastrophically, not loudly, but inwardly. People began to notice things. The way sunlight fell on soup, the sound of spoons touching lips, the strangeness of their own inner monologues. A woman named Fenella began writing down her dreams and discovered they had chapters. A boy named Torben started telling stories before sipping the broth, as if preheating his thoughts. An old man, previously dependent on skulls for advice, spent the stillness staring at his reflection until he forgave it. Klaus, were he still alive, would have smiled. He once wrote in the margins of a recipe, "There will come a day when the bones will say nothing, and that too will be a lesson. The silence is not a failure. It's an invitation." And then, as quietly as it began, the skulls returned. Not loudly, not all at once. Just a single skull one morning emitted a gentle bloop in its broth, like a punctuation mark at the end of a very long pause. It didn't whisper, it didn't glow, it just steeped, and the room felt warmer. One by one, others followed. The whispers were softer now, less insistent, more like a breeze remembering your name, and people listened differently. They no longer demanded answers. They invited presence. They sipped for the companionship, not the cure. The skulls, for their part, seemed content to be heard as they were, not as oracles but as echoes. New rituals emerged. People sat with skulls in silence. No boiling, no recipes, just company. Some tied ribbons around their favorites. Some read them stories. One woman taught her favorite skull how to knit. Admittedly, the results were lumpy. Eventually, a new term was coined: bone listening. It had no rules, no guarantees, just an idea that sometimes healing comes not from what the dead tell you, but from how you choose to sit beside them when they say nothing at all. So tonight, as your room cools and the light fades behind your eyes, imagine a shelf of skulls, content in their stillness, not speaking, not glowing, just being. And beside them, you, a skull of your own, full of thoughts, flavors, quiet storms. Let your silence steep. Let your mind brew gently. Let your bones hum a lullaby you don't need to hear, only feel. You are not empty. You are not lost. You are simply simmering. Sleep well. In the village where the broth always simmered and the silence sometimes whispered, there came a tale too strange even for believers. A skull that would not die. Now, to be clear, it was dead. Physically, biologically, undeniably. No flesh, no eyes, no tongue to wag. And yet, it refused to settle. Most skulls, once boiled, steeped peacefully. Their thoughts became mild. Their memories aromatic. Their regrets soluble. But this one fought back. They called it the stirrer. Not because it stirred physically, it had no arms, but because every time someone tried to boil it, the broth rebelled. One pot cracked down the middle with a noise like thunder holding its breath. Another began to levitate very slightly, then dropped as if offended. A third boiled backward. The steam fell into the pot. It was unsettling. One apothecary fainted. 2 spoons dissolved. Cat ran away and never returned. It was later found sipping wine in a monastery. No one knew the skull's origin. The label simply read, "Unknown. Found mid-scream." It had no known donor, no burial record, no last will scrawled on papyrus. Simply appeared, delivered in a velvet box by a courier who claimed he didn't remember where he got it. Then left, then forgot how to speak for 2 days. Naturally, it drew attention. The Skull Tasting Society held an emergency session. The monks of medicinal musing conducted a full-day chant in Latin and moderate French. The Museum of Thinking Heads declined to display it but offered to mail it a polite letter. Eventually, the skull was passed to Breda, a bone listener of great renown and zero patience. She placed the skull in her tea room, not to boil, not to beg, but to wait it out. She sat across from it for 9 days, drinking from a chipped mug and saying nothing. On the 10th day, she spoke. "You don't want to be soup, do you?" The skull did not move. "You want to be a story." And so it began. The skull that refused to die became the speaker without a mouth. It wasn't boiled. It was consulted. People came from miles to sit with it. They didn't speak to it. They sat beside it, like one does beside a campfire that crackles with unsaid things. Some said it made them feel watched but not judged. Others said they left with ideas that weren't theirs. One woman claimed she solved a lifelong riddle just by polishing its crown. Eventually, someone tried boiling it again. Not out of disrespect, just curiosity. They used all the best ingredients: moon water from a sincere storm, a sage bundle blessed by 3 retired philosophers, a single tear from someone who almost lied. The pot shook, the windows fogged, and then the stew laughed, not loudly, not mockingly, just a single low bloop of amusement like an idea winking. The apothecary fainted from joy. The spoon grew warm and never cooled. The stew turned lavender and vanished before tasting. After that, the skull was declared unboilable but delightful, and it was placed in a seat of honor, not on a shelf but at the table. Every week, people would host a meal with the skull present, not as food, not as decoration, but as conversation itself. Topics included: what does soup dream about? Can silence ferment? Are we our thoughts, or just the spoons that hold them? The skull offered no answers, but somehow better questions bloomed. One evening, someone left a notebook beside the skull. When they returned, it had been filled. No handwriting, no ink, just impressions, pressed gently into the pages, as if thoughts had leaned down to nap and left wrinkles behind. The entries included: don't seek the cure, seek the simmer. Your skull is listening to you too. Boil only what's ready. Some thoughts need marinating. Even emptiness has flavor. So now, dear sleeper, imagine this: a long wooden table, candles flickering, chairs filled with people who aren't afraid to pause, and at the head of the table, a skull. Not boiling, not glowing, just there. It doesn't speak. It doesn't need to. Its presence says, you don't have to be useful to be worthy. You don't have to boil to be warm. Just be. Sleep now. Let your own skull rest, heavy with thoughts, yet lighter with knowing. You are not a recipe. You are not an ingredient. You are the whole table, and someone somewhere is already thankful for the flavor of your silence. Before Klaus, before skull cafes, before bone sommeliers and stew-themed soirees, there were the bone monks, a quiet order, a forgotten brotherhood, sworn to silence, steeping, and spiritual stock. They lived not in monasteries, but in steeping cloisters, remote stone dwellings where the walls smelled faintly of lavender and parsnip. Their robes were simple, their chants were slow, and their most sacred texts were not written in ink, but soup. You see, the bone monks believed that thoughts left residue, not just in diaries, not just in letters, but in bone, specifically the skull. To them, each cranium was a sealed vessel, full of trapped wisdom waiting to be gently released and then consumed, not for flavor, not for medicine, but for communion, a meeting of lives, one sip at a time. Their process was unlike anything seen in the apothecary shops or city stew parlors. They did not boil. They steeped, gently, slowly, thoughtfully. A skull was placed not in a pot, but in a stone basin, filled with warm rainwater and herbs chosen not by name, but by mood. One monk would hold the skull, another would hum, a third would light a candle made from bee-saved wax, not taken, only gathered. Then they would wait, for hours, sometimes days, sometimes until the moon yawned and turned away. They didn't sip the resulting broth like common folk. They anointed themselves with it, a dab behind the ears, a drop on the tongue, a misting on the wrists. They believed this allowed the thoughts to pass through, not into, like wind through curtains or secrets shared with stones. No hallucinations, no visions, just quiet alignment, a sense of rightness like a page turning at the perfect moment. Only rarely did they drink, and when they did, it was during a ritual known as the infusio, a single cup, shared in silence, passed from monk to monk, each one whispering a single word after tasting. Words like, remember, almost, enough, yes, mmm. The last monk never spoke. He simply smiled, and the cup was returned to the shelf, full again with meaning. The bone monks kept no written recipes. To write them down was to miss the point. Instead, they passed down their knowledge through gestures, aromas, and weather-based metaphors. A stew might be described as like snow waiting to fall, like the breath before laughter, like a grandmother humming without knowing why. One monk was said to be so skilled he could identify which herb a skull needed by sniffing its brow ridge. He was called Brother Nose. He was also slightly allergic to thyme, but considered it a noble sacrifice. Their pantry was unusual. Jars labeled, uncertainty mild, hope dried, breadcrumbs of comfort, regret pickled, and one mysterious tin marked only with a skull and the word, don't. No one opened it. No one needed to. Every skull was treated with reverence. Even broken ones. Even cracked ones. Even one that once belonged to a man who had tried to sell fake elbows as a cure for sneezing. They believed that every thought deserved a second breath, and skulls were merely the lung. Over centuries, the bone monks vanished. Not dramatically, not violently, they just steeped themselves into the landscape. Some say their cloisters collapsed inward from the weight of thought. Others believe they simply walked into the mist, leaving behind a single steaming cup of broth and a whisper that said, "You'll know when it's warm enough." Today, only fragments remain. A few stone basins, a handful of rituals passed down through confused grandmothers, and one ancient spoon carved with 7 notches and a single phrase, "Stir only when the silence says so." But their influence lingers, in the way we pause before sipping, in the way certain broths feel more like hugs, in the soft hum that rises from pots left alone too long, as if someone, somewhere, is still humming along. And in every apothecary's heart, there is a quiet shelf, reserved not for the showy skulls or the flamboyant thinkers, but for the gentle ones, the monks in bone, the thoughts that waited, the silence that brewed itself into peace. So tonight, as the world hushes and your thoughts begin to settle, imagine that you are steeping, not boiling, not bubbling, just infusing gently. Let your breath be the spoon. Let your stillness be the broth. Let the quiet speak through your bones. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to be anything. You are enough. You are steeped. You are heard. Sleep now. The monks are watching over you, and the silence is perfect. So, you've decided to make skull broth. Not professionally, of course. Not commercially. Just a casual, personal simmer. For clarity, for comfort, for those long nights when soup feels wiser than conversation. But how do you choose the right skull? This is not a decision to take lightly. As Klaus once scribbled in a margin, choosing the wrong skull is like borrowing a coat that remembers someone else's winter. Let us walk through it together, slowly, gently, as if holding bone wrapped in soft cloth. Step 1. Determine your intention. Are you looking but might help you understand silence better? Be honest with yourself. Skulls can smell confusion, and they dislike being boiled for vague purposes. Step 2. Check the bone weather. Every skull has a temperature, not of heat, but of feeling. Hold it close. Let your palms rest on its sides. Close your eyes. Does it feel crisp like frost? Good for logic. Warm like an old book? Good for nostalgia. Damp with something unspoken? Proceed carefully. Some skulls twitch slightly. Others hum like a kettle far away. If one makes you sneeze, that's a sign of unprocessed grief. Not bad. Just intense. You may wish to steep, not sip. Step 3. Examine the wear patterns. A well-lived skull has texture. Look for soft indentations, signs of laughter. Microscopic stress lines, responsibility. Faint ridges behind the temples, daydreaming. A slightly off-center jaw, lied politely but only once. Skulls that are too smooth may have belonged to people who repressed their feelings. They'll still make broth, but it'll taste like emotional sandpaper. Step 4. Listen, not with your ears, with your presence. Hold the skull. Sit in silence. Don't ask anything. Let it speak first if it wants to. It may show you an image. It may make you remember a smell. It may gently place a question in your spine that you'll only notice a week later while folding laundry. If nothing happens, it may not be ready, or you may not be ready. Put it back kindly. Skulls remember impatience. Step 5. Ask permission. You may think it's a skull. It's dead. Yes, and so are books. But we don't scribble in them without asking. Whisper something respectful. May I steep your thoughts? Would you like to be warm again? Is there something you'd like to release? If the broth curdles, that's a no. If your spoon tilts toward the left, that's a hesitant maybe. If a candle nearby flares, sighs, then dims, that's a yes. Or your drafty window. But why not believe? Bonus tip, don't choose yourself. We get it. You're curious. You want to know what your skull would taste like. Please wait until after your lifetime. The flavor improves dramatically with rest. And also, it's hard to steep yourself without making a mess. Now, let's try a few real examples. Skull number 1, the quiet locksmith. Found in a drawer beneath an old church. Last thought suspected to be oops. When steeped gently in cardamom and rainwater, the resulting broth gives the drinker vivid dreams of doors never opened and keys that don't exist, but should. Best sip before making life decisions, or while organizing clutter. Skull number 2, the forgotten ant. No records, no name, just presence. Smells faintly of gingerbread and apology. Produces a stew that feels like being hugged by someone who doesn't know your name but knows you need one. Warning, may cause temporary interest in genealogy. Skull number 3, the slightly disappointed saint. Still glows faintly, especially near soup spoons. Flavor is complex. Starts with hope, ends with well, I tried. Maybe too heavy for first-time sippers. Pairs well with soft bread and low expectations. By now, perhaps you're realizing. You don't just choose a skull. It chooses you. Like a cat. Or a haunting. Or an idea that settles in your chest and waits for a rainy day. Final thought. Don't rush. There are thousands of skulls. Each one once contained a life. A story. 1,000 thoughts that tried their best. Choose the one that feels like home, but upside down. The one that says, you're not alone. You're just unboiled. Tonight, as you lie beneath your own skull, a loyal helmet of memories, smile softly. You chose well today, even if you didn't sip, even if you just read the labels. That too is listening. Sleep now. Let your thoughts settle like herbs in warm water. Let your silence become flavor. Let your dreams steep. You are not the broth. You are the vessel. And the skull, whether chosen or not, waits for no one, but welcomes all. There came a time after the menus, after the parades, after the silent monks and ethical spoons, when people began to ask, does it even work? Not angrily, not bitterly, just tiredly, like someone who's been sipping ancient soup for years and still forgets where they left the feeling they needed. The skull broth had become so common, so adorned with ritual and poetry and ladle choreography, that its original purpose, to soothe, to cure, had gently boiled away. And so, quietly, humbly, and without dramatic music, someone stopped drinking it. Then another, and another, until whole villages set their pots aside. Shops closed not with curses, but with quiet notes. Gone steeping. Out of thoughts. Try water. People didn't riot. They reflected. What had they expected? Miracles? Answers? An aftertaste of forgiveness? What they got was soup. Delicious, poetic, odd, sacred soup. But still soup. There was a man named Drosk. An old man with a beard that forgot to stop growing. He had been sipping skull broth daily since youth. He tried. The noble general, the disgraced librarian, the left-handed locksmith, the twins who died mid-joke, even the silent philosopher 3 times just in case. And one morning, while stirring a modest pot filled with thoughts once owned by a flute maker named Milda, Drosk paused and said aloud, "What if I'm already cured?" The broth rippled. The spoon stilled. The skull did nothing. And Drosk, for the first time in 63 years, left the cup untouched. You see, sometimes a cure is not about fixing. It's about letting go of the need to be fixed. What skull broth offered, and still does, to those who sip slowly is not a solution, but a witness. A moment where your pain is not erased, but echoed. Not solved, but seen. Not answered, but warmed. People began to use the skulls differently. Some planted flowers in them. Not metaphorically actual flowers. Others used them as bookends for books they never finished. A few started playing music to them, not to awaken them, but to thank them. One artist painted a skull every day for a year. Each painting looked exactly the same, but she swore they were portraits of different moods. A new tradition emerged. It was called the final simmer. When someone decided they no longer needed the skulls, they would perform one last ritual. No boiling, no sipping, no expectation. Just a pot of warm water, a single bay leaf, and the skull placed gently in the center. They would sit beside it and speak aloud all the things they once hoped the broth would cure. I wanted to stop missing her. I wanted to believe I mattered. I wanted the dreams to go away. I wanted a quieter mind. I wanted to remember without hurting. Then they would remove the skull, dry it with a clean cloth, and return it to the shelf now labeled. Heard me. It became enough. To be heard. Apothecaries didn't vanish. They adapted. Shops began to offer empty cups, sold not for their contents, but their possibility. People bought them as gifts. A note inside each cup read, "Sip whatever you need to imagine." One woman filled hers with salt water, another with melted snow. A child filled his with secrets and gave it to the moon. Klaus's legacy was reprinted in a final volume titled, "Instructions for When the Instructions No Longer Apply." The last page was blank, on purpose. So tonight you may be wondering, have I been cured? Was there anything to cure? Am I now broth? The answer? Maybe. Or maybe you've simply been sitting long enough with yourself to feel less like a problem and more like a soup warming gently in its own time. Let this be your final simmer. No questions, no stirring, no checklist, just presence. You, your skull, your thoughts like herbs in warm stillness. The pot is quiet now. The ladle rests. You don't need to boil anything tonight. Just sleep. Let the silence flavor your dreams. Let your breath fog the windows of your skull gently. And when morning comes, you may still want soup, but this time you'll choose the flavor. After the last pot cooled. After the ladles were hung and the spoons fell still. After the skulls were dusted and thanked and placed on shelves not as cures but as companions. What remained? Not broth, not steam, not even ritual. What remained was the bone, the shape of memory, the echo of thought, the soft, hollow weight of something that once dreamed of being understood. In a small museum in a small town that no longer hosts stew competitions, there is a room with no labels, no plaques, no stories, no explanations, just skulls, lined up gently, facing forward, not demanding anything, not offering miracles, just being. People walk through the room in silence. Some cry, some laugh softly. One man once hugged the air. No one is asked to understand. No one is asked to believe. They are simply witnessed. One child, after her first visit, whispered to her mother, "They look like they're listening." And perhaps they are. Perhaps they always were. Not all skulls were wise. Not all were kind. Some belonged to liars. Some to heroes. Some to people who couldn't finish their own stories. But in death, they were all equalized. Each one, a room once filled with thunder, laughter, rage, longing. Now hollow, now still, and still somehow holding something. Not facts, not answers, but a kind of patience that the living rarely have. What do we do with that? We don't boil it. We don't sell it. We live beside it. We let it remind us that our thoughts, too, will cool. That our regrets, too, may soften. That one day our skull may sit quietly on a shelf and say nothing at all, and that will be enough. Klaus's own skull was never steeped. It was placed in a garden, under a pear tree, surrounded by thyme and quiet bees. Visitors still go there. They don't ask questions. They just sit, and sometimes they leave behind spoons. Not to dig, not to stir, just to say. I remember, a new tradition emerged. People began carving poems into their own skulls before death. Microscopic etchings, only visible with magnifying lenses and enough forgiveness. One said, "If you're reading this, you made it." Another said, "I never quite figured it out." "That's okay." One simply said, "Sorry, I meant well." The skulls became not just vessels of past thoughts, but places to leave kindness for strangers, like memory mailboxes, like head-shaped hope chests, like unfinished lullabies hummed in bone. Eventually, no one boiled skulls anymore, not because they didn't work, but because people had learned to listen to themselves. And when they needed silence, they'd hold a skull, any skull, and say, "You once tried to understand the world." Me too. That was enough. No heat, no ladle, just quiet empathy between two hollow domes of wondering. So now, as you drift toward the soft end of this story and your breath slows and the pillow meets the back of your thinking, let me tell you one last truth. Your skull is beautiful, not for how it looks, not for what it knows, but for what it holds. You, the tiredness, the questions, the absurd thoughts you've never told anyone, the unfinished dreams, the quiet you carry. And one day, long, long from now, maybe someone will hold your skull and say, "They must have loved deeply. This bone is full of stories." So rest now, not like an ending, like a soft lid on a slow pot, like a final thought exhaling itself into peace. No need to stir, no need to remember, no need to solve. You were steeped, you were seasoned, you were done for now. Sleep gently, little skull. The world can wait.